Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/311, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 311th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thank you so much for joining. On this edition, the Winter 2023 preview, and I'll just get this out of the way. We're going back to Florida. It is a now annual, but for pandemic trip, it seems like, to do a ride in Central Florida. I have promised to try to do things a little bit differently in past years, but no, we're basically doing essentially the same ride, but with a few modifications to it. So if you're brand new to the show, or if you have been around for the winter tours, sure, it's the same route, but is it? Let's just start off with the basics here. It is a flight in from DC, where I live, to Tampa, Florida, the Tampa airport, and riding directly out of the airport, going to Lakeland, Florida, and then a second day from Lakeland, Florida to Lake Buena Vista, Florida, and Disney World. But, for those of you who have heard this song and dance before, every ride, as you know, is different, and this one's a little bit refined in a few different ways compared to past years. I think that the biggest thing that I've looked at doing is I've improved the route on day one, and I would call it optimized as a better route from Tampa Airport to MLK Blvd, which is the real route out of the city of Tampa. And what this does is it's a trade-off. In past years, I have basically deviated is a way to get into the Tampa waterfront area, which is essentially downtown Tampa, if you're familiar with it. There's the hockey arena, there is an aquarium, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. What else is down there? University of South Florida, I think, is down there as well. Well, the thing that I ran into last year, which was kind of a drag, was I ran into a 10K. And so many cities now that we're in the kind of the post-COVID time are doing tons of things on weekends. I fly in typically on a Saturday when I do these rides. And as a result, what I have found last year was it really set me back. It was hard to kind of maneuver around things, and it was a little bit of a hassle. Of course, if you want to listen to that, you can listen to last year's tour journal. Was it the end of the world? No, but everything is a trade-off, and I decided I wanted to be able to maximize day one, to be able to do something that I've always wanted to do and always feel like I don't have the time to do. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. But what I've effectively done is I brought my route north of downtown this year to avoid those weekend activities. I looked it up. It doesn't appear that there is a 10K this year like last year, but you just never know. I also have found that it's a very well-used, multi-use path that is the bulk of that portion of the trip. And on a Saturday morning, a beautiful Saturday morning as it is looking like, we'll talk about weather in a bit, that you end up running into the possibility of just having to go around a lot of people, a lot of, side-by-side people strolling, enjoying the sunshine as they are allowed and welcome to do on MLT's path. But it's just a little difficult if you're trying to make some miles, particularly early in the morning. I've also seen it all, quite frankly. This is going to be the fourth time that I've done this ride, and it would be the third time that I've gone down to the waterfront. So I decided to trade it for something else. And that trade for something else is the wonderful Ybor CIty, which is a section of Tampa that is to the east of downtown. And it is the traditional Cuban and Latin American-influenced part of Tampa. It is super cool. And the route always ends up going through it. And every single year I have felt I got to keep going. Last year it was because I was really behind. I believe the flight was a little bit late. As you may recall, I had an issue, although I didn't know it at the time. I had lost my ID. I was running late, and it was a pretty warm day, and I wanted to try to beat the heat. Well, I failed in all of those elements, and once again had to end up going through Ybor CIty. By the way, I'm finally pronouncing it correctly. It is spelled Ybor. Assume that it's a Spanish pronunciation given the influences of the area, and I'm terrible at Spanish. I never had any formal Spanish training, and basically I'm not very smart with the pronunciations. But I looked it up this time because that's what you do when you actually are interested in a place. And anyways, it is pronounced Ybor CIty. I apologize to the Cuban community and anybody else who lives in Tampa for my mispronunciations through the years. The reason why I want to stop there is because it is just culturally so rich. It is a community in an area that I just don't have as much experience with. And so as a result, I'm curious and interested. And so I did a little bit of research, and there's a ton of different things. Of course, I'm going to be there in the morning. If I had been there a little bit later, or maybe at the end of my ride, it would have been probably a little more interesting to check out the cigar shops and to sample some of that, maybe get a beer or something along those lines, because there's quite a few really interesting bars in that area. Because it's going to be the morning, though, I think we're going to limit my exposure a bit. And I've already taken a look at a couple of different places that look like really good morning coffee and breakfast stops there in Ybor CIty. So I'm super excited about that. I'm already trying to figure out what I'm going to order. I don't know. I'm just really excited about all this. There's different coffee styles and things like that. So it's going to be a real experience, something that I've wanted to do for a while. I'm going to bring you along for all of that. Now, continuing along on the day one route, from that point on, from Ybor CIty, normally what I would do is I went on a bit of a back road that was through an industrial area. And I took a look at my options, and I decided to get out of Ybor CIty and move up to MLK Blvd a little bit more quickly. That ends up being US 92 by that point. And of course, if you've followed the show at all, and the one thing that I've learned through the years, when you look at highway signs, the classic blue and red shield is an interstate. We typically can't bike on those with a few exceptions. The thing that's really interesting are US highways. They are black lettering, black numbers actually, on a white shield. Those often, not always, but very often have excellent bike infrastructure attached to them. Bike lanes, in fact, marked bike lanes for miles and miles and miles and miles. And sometimes they'll end up being protected bike lanes, but at the very least, even though they're going through often very busy areas, stroads, if you're into that kind of labeling, they continue to have that bike infrastructure. So I'm getting up to there more quickly than normal and in past years, in part because I'm a little skittish of the road debris that is in the other area. Not that I wouldn't necessarily get road debris in this particular route, and it's only a few additional miles on MLK as opposed to the route that I've done before. But still, I've decided that this is what I'm going to try to do. Again, this is all about optimizing. And what it really is going to end up doing, I think, is it's going to be a faster ride based on the mileage of day one as well. I also decided that my hotel in Lakeland, I decided to change. One, it was a little sketch. And also, I had the near problem of checking into a hotel where the guy really wanted to see an ID and I didn't have one. Luckily, I had a picture of my ID, which I had taken for something completely unrelated. I was really lucky I had that because that seemed to be enough. Not having an ID can be a real problem, it seems, in life sometimes. And I know lots of people live their lives perfectly fine without a driver's license and without other IDs, but it can be a problem. So checking into a hotel, flying, those are two of them that I discovered. I'm not going to do that again, as we'll talk about later. So I decided to change the hotel, but that wasn't the only reason. The biggest thing was that Lakeland is a really cool town. Where that hotel and where several other hotels are, which are kind of the furthest away hotels, the last chance hotels, essentially, before the route begins on day two. I couldn't even add more miles, really, to be able to get to alternative lodging. The idea is that in that area, it's all big box restaurants and things like that. And I'd like to at least have the opportunity to have dinner someplace that has at least a regional kind of an influence, a Florida kind of a thing, or perhaps even a local to Lakeland kind of a thing. And I identified one area that's couple of miles short of where I had been staying before, and there are some options in there that I think look pretty good. Will I necessarily take advantage of them? I don't know, but I at least want the option for that. So better than gas station cuisine, which is what I had last year. And, the other kind of restaurants that if you live in the United States, you could be anywhere in the United States. I would like something where it's a little bit more local. So that's the end of day one right there, just as a bit of an overview. Of course, there's going to be tons more detail when we go through the tour journal of day one. Day two features, as I mentioned before, another ride into Walt Disney World. But this one I'm going to do in a slightly different way. It's going to have an option. The mileage on the day is probably going to depend on how I feel at the end of the day. Last year, the weather was much warmer than I anticipated, and I wasn't really prepared for it. This year, I'm not going to make the same mistake, so I would really like to be able to hit the longer version of this ride, which would take me up and over through the north entrance to the Walt Disney World property. Now, last year, if you followed along, and I did a video along with it, I went through what I would characterize as the west entrance. There's really only two, as far as I can tell, safe ways to get into Walt Disney World property by bike. Most of the roads are straight up highways with absolutely zero infrastructure and tourists and locals who are not looking for you on a bicycle. So there are definitely roads that are absolutely off limits from my perspective. The north entrance is the one that I had a listener about a year ago now write in and pointed me to. I found a different entrance, that west entrance, and of course I took you along for that ride. This time, although it adds another 10 miles to the ride, I would really like to do this because my intention, as we'll talk about it at the end of the day here, is to have a little bit of a victory celebration at the end of day two, because it's the end of effective riding at that point. The north entrance would bring me to a more interesting place from my perspective. However, if it ends up being a rough day, if it ends up being a point where I'm just sort of like, I got 2 miles left in me or less rather than 10 miles, then I do have a bit of a bailout there. And I would end up going to a different spot to handle that victory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I would really prefer to go and do this longer route because I would like to see that additional option for getting into Disney World property and add that kind of to the list of resources in case anybody out there is foolish enough to want to do such a thing. I feel like the Venn diagram of bicycle touring and interest in Disney World to the level that I have of it is probably a pretty narrow sliver, but it is what it is. All right, let's talk a little bit about the gear because this has been a bit of a journey and I've got layers of the onion of stories to share with you. So I briefly considered bringing the larger bike, the Safari, down to Florida for this trip. And the reason why I was considering doing that is because I think that I'd like to try to do some stealth camping as the way that I bridge day one and day two. And I thought that it might be possible to do something like that around the Van Fleet Trail. If you are not familiar with that, you haven't listened to the past tour journals when I've done this, the Van Fleet Trail does a lot of heavy lifting on early day two. It is a north-south former rail right-of-way, which is now a rail trail, and it's pretty fantastic. And it strikes me that there is a possibility of doing some stealth camping somewhere in and around there. The problem is that I always get hung up on Florida wildlife. I myself understand what's going on down there in terms of the critters and the time of year, and I just don't want to deal with that, quite frankly. It's too much of a question mark. It's also more logistically that I would have to haul. I typically would be flying down on Southwest Airlines. You can check a bunch of bags. Checking the bike would certainly count as one of them. This would not be, I think, an issue. It would be additional cost, but that of course would be outweighed by the fact that I wouldn't have the extra hotel night in there. So cost isn't really an issue here, but I think that just logistically, the critter elements, the unfamiliarity of the area, not really knowing whether or not there's good, true stealth camping opportunities in the area that I think that there might be, that ended up being the deal breaker for this year. I think one of the things that I'm going to do, and this will be on day 2 of the tour journal, is I'm going to spend a fair amount of time really scoping out the areas around the Van Fleet Trail. actually all of the areas out from the point out of Lakeland starting on day 2 to see if there was any kind of a decent stealth camping option, because I think I would like to give that a shot some year. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the Safari that I'd be using for it, but things to think about for the future. This seems to be, as I've talked about, a ride that I do every year. And if it is going to be an every year kind of a thing, I'd like to shake it up a little bit more next time. So that is going to be part of it. So that's kind of a sidebar on the gear choice. We're going to be doing it the same way we did it before. Brompton. The Brompton is going to be what we're going to do, and it's credit card touring essentially for this particular ride. No camping at all. Quick little sidebar on the Brompton. My Brompton is currently residing over at the great DC local bike shop called BicycleSpace. It is the one that I use for all of my bikes. I like them an awful lot, even though they are now fully inconveniently located on the other side of town from where I am. They used to have a more local option, but they contracted, as so many bike shops have, into one particular shop. I brought it in for something that's been bothering me for a while, and that is my seat post. Bromptons are the way they fold. The seat post is a major component, and there's a lock on it, a lockdown cinching mechanism on it that keeps your saddle basically at the right height. And it's been a problem for, well, really at least a year. It certainly was starting in California during the spring ride last year, and of course I've been just sort of dealing with it this whole time. I knew that there was something wrong with it. I thought I would bring it in and have them take a look at it. I figured there's a sleeve within the mechanism. I won't bore you with all the Brompton details to it, but I did think that it would be worth getting fixed, because on a long ride with a Brompton, it's really irritating to have to stop every couple of miles and readjust your saddle. So I did that. I brought it in, and the mechanic, James, I'm going to give James a shout out here. You know, I've had this bike for more than a few years, and I've ridden this bike pretty hard over the years and have never had to replace any real components to it. No brake pads, no nothing. Well, the brake pads were certainly shot, and I knew that. I was going to actually mention that before he said that they were fried because, well, yeah. And then I thought, you know what, maybe the chain could stand to be replaced. And he also, again, saw it before I did. And I said, as he was pulling out the little caliper kind of style tool to see whether or not it's been stretched too much, I said, you know what, even if it's just marginally okay, I'd rather replace it. He says, oh no, it's way out of whack. And I was like, okay, well, there you go then. And he kept looking and looking and digging, and basically a whole lot of things needed to get done. And it's a real testament, I think, to the build quality of the Brompton that, one, I haven't had to replace any of these things for years, and two, it still rides pretty well and shifts pretty well considering how much stuff really needed to get done. The internal hub needed to be basically re-dipped and gunk pulled out and all those other things, new chain, new brake pads, a whole bunch of different things. You know how much I've ridden this bike on tours. It really needed some work done to it. So in any event, while I brought it in thinking, because I was the frog boiling in water, I didn't realize how bad things had gotten. I'm really grateful to BicycleSpace and James in particular for being able to figure out what was going on. In fact, they said it was done just the other day as I'm sitting here recording. And then they gave me a call and said, hey, hold off a second, because they gave it one more additional little test ride. And they said, something is funky with one of the gears, and we really want to take a second look at it tomorrow, as they were calling, and just give us another day, because I told them that I had a couple of weeks. So that, I'm really grateful that they take great care to it. James himself actually said when he kind of dug into the build, because this is a real custom build by the good folks over at Clever Cycles in Portland, Oregon, my favorite local bike shop in Portland, Oregon, if you wish to ask. So he was really impressed with the work that they did with the speed drive and the doubling of the gears and all the things that made this a real quality touring bike. So I think he's had some fun working on all of that. Suffice to say, the bike is going to ride like a charm when I get it back, and I'm really excited to get that down there in Central Florida and give it a whirl over the course of the 100 or so miles that I'll be riding it. Okay, so that was the sidebar on all of that. Also, this was not a cheap amount of work to be done. So thank you, Pedalshift Society. Thank you, anonymous donors, including the most recent anonymous donor who managed to get the funds to me in a unique way, and I think has done this before. So if you're listening, thank you very much for doing that. Thank you all for your support. You actually help make these tours happen in addition to making this podcast happen. So thank you. All right, so let's get back to the broader concept of the gear that's going to be used here. I have considered going to the old backpack version again to eliminate the need for the duffel. Again, if you're new to the show, my modification of how I tour with a Brompton has really gone through some evolution. I'd like to really give a shout out to the folks over at Pathless Pedaled, Russ in particular, for coming up with what I like to call the backpack method, which you can look it up. It's a really excellent way to create a lot of carrying space on a Brompton. And I absolutely mimicked everything that they did down to the final detail when I was first touring with this bicycle. I made some changes over time because, as I discovered, having a large backpack was a little bit of an overkill for most of what I was doing. So I made some changes, and what I would do is I would bring a collapsible duffel that would serve to transport all of the various things that I needed to be checked in an airplane situation, while I would bring the Brompton into the plane as a carry-on and would go in the overhead. And it's worked really, really well for me over the years. For reasons, I was reconsidering going back to the backpack way, but I do believe that the reason why the backpack method is excellent and really, really good, it's better for longer distance touring when you are camping, because you get much more capacity within it. As I've been sitting here thinking about it, it just would be more weight for me to roll with for capacity that I wasn't going to be using. So I think I've decided that I'm not going to do that, but I may reconsider doing that if I use it for a camping version next year, if we do any stealth camping, or for some other camping-based Brompton tour that I end up doing. Because what I think I might consider doing is expanding the cockpit a little bit, because I wouldn't be needing the pannier on the front in the luggage space, so I could do something a little bit different there. That might be a future episode as I kind of rethink and redesign additional ways to tour with a Brompton. It's very flexible, and I'm really intrigued with kind of changing things up a little bit, at least for the thought process, at least for the experimental elements of all of that. But I do think that for the moment, I'm going to stick with the system that seems to be the quasi-perfected manner in which I use the Brompton for a non-camping ride, a credit card touring ride, and that is a single Ortlieb pannier that hangs on the luggage rack block frame, say that 10 times fast, and then a dry bag that goes on the rear that may or may not be necessary. I'm going to have to do a little bit of packing to determine whether or not I need that at all. If at the very least the duffel, which would contain things that I can't bring as a carry-on in, tools and certain things that contain sharp things that they don't like you to bring onto planes for going on 12, 15 years now. So that is what I am going to be doing. So one other additional sidebar when it comes to gear, and this is a little bittersweet. I got some new Ortlieb backrollers, a pair of them, because they were incredibly cheap on a particular outfitter. They're sold out, so I won't bother mentioning it. But sadly, orange is no longer an option. I've looked at this for the better part of a couple of years since I went to the show in Chicago a few years ago about this time. And it turns out they said that orange is an option, but orange is not an option in the back roller. And I think they may have gotten rid of orange across the line by 2023 anyways. So I knew that there was going to come a day when I was going to need to replace my very, very, very well used Ortlieb panniers. And I finally did, because I found a good sale for them. And drum roll on the color, I ended up getting blue as my color. My choice for the two sale items were either bright yellow or blue. And I'm just not a yellow guy. So although you could make the argument that yellow gives you a little bit more visibility, I decided to go with the blue. They're kind of like a medium blue, a royal blue. And I'm very excited to have them. One thing that I'll mention is I think that the other reason why I went with blue is it's at least arguably better from a stealth perspective. And as I'm trying to be more mindful with some of my gear to try to make it at least marginally better for stealth camping, that was kind of the thing that brought it over the top, in addition to a preference of blue over yellow. I am not getting rid of orange. Orange is too much a part of my life, as you all know. Go orange. But I'm probably going to be semi-retiring the orange panniers. They are probably going to be having a full-time role in the Brompton setup, as I've described, where I use a single pannier that fits on the front. I've been trying to figure out if there's a way that I could bungee or otherwise put on the second orange pannier onto the rear rack. I'm still messing around with that a little bit. It's too long to hang from the rear rack, but it's something I'm working on. But I think what's going to happen is that the orange panniers are going to become full-time Brompton panniers, and the blue ones will end up going on to the larger bike for bigger, more robust adventures. So there is your gear sidebar. A little bit of an end of an era. The orange panniers are still functional. They just need to be repaired consistently every single year. And it's time that I got new ones. And I still am a big fan of Ortlieb. That those things have been through a lot and many miles and a lot of abuse and a lot of rain, but it was time to get a new set. So blue. We have blue panniers, but the logo, everything with the show will remain orange because that is who I am. All right. That is it for the gear portion of this tour. A few odds and ends to talk about for the remainder of this particular tour preview. Let's talk about weather. Last year was sunny and flirted with pretty hot. I was not ready for it. I think that the most important thing that I can do is to make sure that I'm on top of the fact that 70 degrees and sun these days for me, especially because I'm so used to a lot colder than that, feels and acts a lot hotter for me. Also, the humidity, while it is dry by Florida standards, it's humid by my standards for this time of year. So going down into those conditions where I'm acclimatized to very dry and pretty cold, down to below freezing at times, I gotta change things up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be more prepared this year to cover up and have sunscreen in hand before day one. In fact, I've already ordered it and it is on its way. So I'm going to make sure that I've got my sun sleeves. I'm going to make sure that I've got sunscreen. I know that I'm not going to try to ride in long pants this year. I have tried to ride in long pants in warmer climates, just from a sun exposure perspective, but it's just too much. It's really draining and energy sapping to be wearing long pants in this particular environment at this particular time of year when my body is more used to and acclimatized towards cold and very dry. So we're going to do shorts. We're going to do sunscreen. We're going to have sun sleeves on, hat, the whole 9 yards. So that's a really important thing. One thing that I will mention, though, is I'm mindful of the fact that conditions can change. I do have my eye on the long-term for entertainment purposes only forecast. And right now it is looking a lot like last year. It's looking like at this point where I'm sitting here, the forecast for the first day is highs in the upper 70s with sun, which to me says you got to be prepared for it, got to be ready for it. That said, just in the last few months, we had that bomb cyclone that came through around Christmas time. And it's always possible that we end up having an unusual weather event that brings temperatures way down, maybe down into the 40s. That's how cold it was getting in Central Florida during all of that. So I'm right now, because we're in the for entertainment purposes only time zone, I'm keeping an eye on things for those 2 days of cycling. Right now, it seems like it's going to be pretty normal, i.e. hot, but I'm going to really focus in as we get closer to 3 days out, because I think that's when you can start to say, you know what, this is a forecast I can bank on. So the likelihood of weather being probably on the warm side, but again, making sure that I don't do anything foolish and go down there expecting it to be highs in the 70s, upper 70s, and there being some unusual front that comes down and makes it much, much colder. More to come, of course, on that during the tour journals. I want to mention a couple of things that I want to do and some things I don't want to do with this tour. Things I want to do, I've already mentioned. Ybor CIty. Every time I go through there, I feel like I need to make miles. I mentioned this before. This time I'm stopping. I'm stopping for a little bit. I'm smelling the roses. I'm getting coffee styles that I've never had before. I'm going to enjoy a little bit of breakfast. I'm excited to really stop in and soak up Ybor CIty. Very excited about that. Second thing on day one, I'll mention these a little bit here. Dinner at a more Florida option in Lakeland, at least to give me the opportunity for that. The hotel that I stayed at last time and the time before that, there's just no good local option. So I'm at least giving myself some kind of an option there. Now, third thing that I want to do is I want to get a victory drink. Okay, I talked about the victory celebration. Let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. I will again promise to you, because I know the vast majority of you are probably utterly uninterested in my Walt Disney World elements of all of this, except for maybe to make sure I don't get hit by a car in Disney World. My victory drink is a way of breaking my dryuary part 1, which, by the way, has been very successful. A little bit of a quick weight update. I had said that on the last episode that I had a goal of losing 10 pounds before my tour. I am already in stretch goal territory. I may even break stretch goal territory, depending on how things go over the next few days / few weeks. So that's kind of exciting. So I do believe that I am allowed to and will break my dryuary for the end of the trip. And I'm going to do that at one of 2 resorts at Walt Disney World. The first one, part of the longer route, is actually kind of sneakily maybe one of my favorite resorts. It's the Polynesian Resort. It's sort of like a 70s episode of the Brady Bunch when they went to Hawaii. It's kind of like that vibe, but there's also some really cool kind of bars there as well with unusual drinks and blah, 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 blah. I think that would be kind of a fun thing to do. And the good news is that it would be an easy component to add into as I roll in to finish up essentially the tour, the riding part of the tour. And that would be what I'd like. If I end up doing the shorter version of the ride, I would end up going to a resort called the Coronado Springs Resort, which I have stayed at as well. That's got more of kind of a Mexican kind of flair to it. And there's a really cool bar that's right on one of the lakes there. That's where I would end up going. So victory drink, no matter what, that's what I would like to be doing. And it's going to be a way of breaking dryuary part 1. Then I will be doing another little bit more of dryuary through February as I continue, with the possible exception of the Bills going to the Super Bowl. I do not want to jinx it. They're still playing as I speak right now, or about to play. Last but not least, on things that I want to do, I want to keep my caloric party within reason. One of the things that has been really successful for getting back into shape and getting the weight down has been monitoring my caloric intake. Now, one thing that I do recognize when you are touring is you need calories, and you need quick and easy calories that come from eating, not from what you have stored through the winter. And so as a result, I'm definitely going to be eating robustly during the rides. But what I don't want to do is go too crazy with all of that. I think I'm going to be monitoring and measuring the calories that I do end up eating. I want to at least be replacing the calories that I'm taking in, but I'm probably going to be eating a lot more kind of junky food, just because junky food tends to be easier for your body to turn into quick energy. So I'm going to eat much worse, but I do want to keep it somewhat within reason. The other thing that I really want to make sure that I do is, in the days following, while I'm probably going to reward myself by going off metering for a couple of days while celebrating in Disney World the end of the tour and celebrating a little bit of weight loss, I don't want to go too crazy, because that historically is what ends up happening to me. At least when I look back, on my weight adventure. Often I will go on long, big summer tours, and then I'll just kind of like say, whatever. And then all of a sudden it's the holidays, and then all of a sudden, I'm several pounds, way more heavier than I want to be by the end of that whole process. So bike touring, I think, is a semi-contributor to all of this. So I don't want that to happen. So keeping my caloric party within reason is my final of the things that I want to do. Let's talk about things I don't want to do. Number one, I don't want to run into any 10Ks. I think I've solved that with my route, as we talked about. Number two, I do not want to lose my ID. That happened last year, if you were not with us then, when I did a change of clothes in the bathroom at the airport before I started my ride. I can assure you I am going to be very, very careful to double check that I have everything with me before I leave the airport, because that was a problem with a capital P, and I don't want to run into that again. I will not lose my ID. I will not lose anything. Why don't we just say we won't lose anything? Third thing I don't want to do on this tour, I don't want to get sunburn, and I don't want to get too much sun otherwise, because that has created problems for me in a couple of different ways. Number one, sunburn is very bad for you. It is a precursor to getting skin cancer, something I would like to avoid in my life. Also, just getting too much sun means that I'm not going to be efficient. I'm not going to be optimized for riding. So I want to make sure I'm covered up. I want to make sure that I'm drinking plenty of water, getting enough electrolytes, because I do anticipate that this is going to be a hot ride. Getting too much sun is, well, as you all know, not my favorite thing. So I'm going to make sure that I'm pretty covered up for all of this. Last but not least, things I don't want to do. I don't want to have a Brompton mechanical. One of the big reasons why I brought the Brompton into the bike shop and I talk so much about it is because I'm really fearing having a Brompton mechanical on this particular ride. As you recall, last year, one of the things that I felt really, really grateful for was the tire that created the flat, essentially, the tire that just got worn down to the nub, and then I got thorns in it, and that created multiple flats. I just couldn't find the thorn, couldn't get it out. That happened in a place, while not ideal, at least I was somewhere close to a place where I could get to public transportation to get me to a very good Brompton shop where they had the tire that I wanted in stock. This is not going to be the case in Central Florida. I've looked at it before. I believe that there are no Brompton-specific shops in Orlando, in the Orlando area. And there actually isn't even one in Tampa, if memory serves. I believe it's in Clearwater, which is just not easy. I'd be having to use rideshare in a whole lot. It would be a thing. So I am really grateful, and I'm glad I had the foresight to bring the bike in for the saddle post related issue. And I'm doubly grateful for the fact that I said, hey, let's take a look at things, and realizing that there were some things that were pretty worn down. Would they have gone on this trip? Maybe, maybe not. But I feel really confident that at the end of the day here, having this bike get what is, for all intents and purposes, for Brompton, a pretty major overhaul, I think that that's going to ensure, well, I don't want to tempt the bike gods. Let's not say ensure, but it's going to help prevent the possibility of getting a mechanical on this bike. I've got reasonably new tires on there. Everything's getting double and triple checked. Everything is going to be, I think, in about as tip-top of a shape as you can possibly be for a tour on this bike. So I'm doing everything I can to avoid a Brompton mechanical, because if I do get one on this ride, especially in certain parts of the rural sections of the ride, rural lawyer, I think that was from some comedy. Was it from 30 Rock? Anyways, I don't want that. And so I think I've managed to do some things to prevent that. So a little bit of programming note before we wrap things up on this particular edition of the show. As I mentioned before, the first edition of the tour journal for this tour is going to be in 2 weeks from the release date of this, so 2 Thursdays from now. Next week's best of is going to be the start of a multi-part adventure highlighting something that I talked about on the podcast years and years ago, but it was one of the tour journals that I originally had available only to Pedalshift Society members way back then, who could get it live and in real time, and also for purchase, which I've now taken those all down so that I can do what I'm doing right now and release them as part of best ofs. These will be brand new to the vast majority of you over the next several months as part of the best ofs. It is my DC to Boston using mostly transit and a little bit of very critical folding bike riding. It is something that I'm looking at doing, maybe not this particular type of repeat trip, but I really want to do another very transit forward stunt like this. And I've already got a few ideas. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to share this great best of with you starting next week with a best of. So to sum it all up, wonderful, fun best ofs coming to you over the next couple of months, highlighting a pretty wacky stunt that I did, which you'll learn more about next week if you haven't been a part of it, weren't around way back in the day. And then, of course, in 2 weeks, you get to hear the first edition of the first day of the trip that I just got done the better part of this entire episode describing. So lots of fun stuff coming. I've got yet another tour that actually is 95% figured out that will be coming very, very shortly. So we've got a ton of great content coming, a lot of me on the bike, a lot of sharing trips, and hopefully some fun things to come. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Izuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, and Sam Scruggs. And thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.